Hi guys, I'm Mike from Bokeh Film Studios, and today I want to talk to you about how I set up for a ceremony the day of one of the weddings I'm filming. Man, when I was first starting out in wedding filmmaking, the ceremony was probably the one section of the day that I think I was the most nervous for. You didn't want to screw it up. You wanted to get all the angles that you could, but you also wanted to stay out of people's way. And depending on what style ceremony is going on, if you're in a Catholic church, if you're outside, it's like, oh my God, like I need to know what to do prior to me even getting there. And I think that I've found a way that works great for me, and hopefully this is a system that helps you out as well. If you haven't watched my video on the lenses that I use, I would encourage you to watch that first. Mostly because I purchased lenses with a very specific purpose, and part of that is in how I set up my ceremony. There is no accident or mistake in the equipment that I choose. I'm pretty specific in what I use, and I'm specific in how I use it as well. So I would encourage you to watch that first. If you think of the ceremony as almost like a diamond, that's kind of how I set up my 3 cameras. For starters, let me tell you that I use the A7 III. That's really my camera 1. It's the newest technology from Sony, the best battery as well. And it's the camera that I use pretty much the entire day for anything that is just one-on-one filmmaking. The second camera is really my camera B, and that's going to be the Sony A6500. It is a crop sensor, which in all reality actually helps me quite a bit for the ceremony, because any lens that I have is only going to be that much closer to the bride and groom because it is a crop sensor. This might sound a little bit shocking, but my camera 3 is my A7S II. It is quickly becoming a camera that I barely use. I cannot stand the autofocus anymore. The other 2 cameras are just that much faster. I really can't stand the battery life anymore now that I've got the A7 III. And so it's just quickly become my camera 3, and I'm probably gonna end up selling that camera pretty soon in anticipation of the A7S III, whenever the heck that comes out. So for me, I set up 2 cameras on the outsides of the ceremony. And that's going to end up being pretty much the far angles of the church, or if it's outside, it's even better. You've got more room to work with. But for me, I'm gonna set up, it doesn't really matter which one, but probably the A7S II on the 70-200 on one side of the aisle. And then I'm gonna set up on the opposite side probably the A6500 on my 85 lens. And what I do with those is I'm going to kind of shoot in a V pattern towards the bride and groom. Typically, the groom ends up, if I'm looking down the aisle, the groom tends to end up on the right side and the bride ends up on the left side. That's, again, if I'm looking down the aisle. So I'm going to have one camera on the left aisle shooting the groom, because the groom's facing this way, and that just makes sense. And then I'm gonna have the one on the right side of the aisle shooting the bride. So it's kind of shooting in this cross pattern so that I'm able to get their faces and a little bit off the shoulder of the opposite person that they're getting married to. When I do this, I'm shooting exclusively in 4K, and the reason is that I never know exactly where the bride and groom are going to be. I stay a little bit wider so that I can punch in, and the clarity is so much better doing that in 4K than in 1080p. That's why I decide to get a little bit wider, punch in so that it's nice and tight and close, and you know, the bride and groom are actually in the screen. Now, of course, once I'm all set up, the bride comes down the aisle, I'm putting down my camera 1, I'm going to my camera 2 and my camera 3 just to reframe things, of course, but you're just trying to set up the best that you can to make sure that you're capturing as much as you can. Okay, so now I've got my 2 cameras that are on the outsides there. How do I get the shots right down the aisle? Well, I'll tell you what I do. If I am a run and gun filmmaker, there's nobody else there with me, it's just me. Honestly, I am standing right where the bride is going to end up. That way I can shoot straight down the aisle, and then I can turn real quickly to the groom to get a reaction shot and then come right back. Keep in mind, I've got 2 other cameras that are filming different things from time to time. As the bride's coming down, sometimes I take one of the 2 cameras that are on either aisle and I'll face it backwards so that it's also pointing down the aisle. What that does is it gets the crowd as they rise for the bride. It also tends to get, some other things of people coming down the aisle before the bride comes. One of the things that I was experiencing is if I would point a camera towards that back door when the bride would come out, the view is completely blocked the second that the bride starts walking down the aisle because everybody gets out of their seat and then you can't see. I still do that from time to time though, because I am getting a second shot of all the bridesmaids coming down and that moment when the bride opens the door with her father and everybody comes up. That's kind of a cool shot. So sometimes I'll aim that the other way, mostly because I'm gonna have a camera just kind of like filming me as I'm standing in the way of the groom, so might as well have that other angle shot set up. So I'll be standing where the bride's gonna end up, and I'm shooting down the aisle. I'm also turning to get looks of the groom, but this just gives me the ability of getting, at least a couple seconds of every single bridesmaid that's coming down. It also allows me to get the bride as she is coming down with her father, whoever's walking her down the aisle. I just personally think that this is the best to get as much footage of that happening, and then also the handoff to the groom. I kind of have to back up a little bit to get some of that so that I'm not in the way. I will also say that I'm almost always shooting this section of the wedding from this camera right down the aisle in 1080p 60 frames per second. I really like the idea of as the bride is coming down the aisle, of getting that slow motion cinematic look and then cutting to the groom where hopefully they're smiling or maybe even tearing up. That's usually the best for a cinematic feel to the wedding. And I can kind of splice that up and put it into the film. It usually works out the best. Now, if I've got a second shooter, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll have them stand at the top of the aisle, filming all the things that I just talked about, and then I'll be on a gimbal following the bride and her father as they're coming around, going down the aisle, and getting shots from them, getting shots of them from behind. That's not something that I do all the time. It does look really nice, especially in an outdoor wedding, but to be honest, it's not something that needs to happen. It's just another setup that you could choose to do. So what do I do with my camera once the bride comes down the aisle? Well, the truth is I take that camera one and I kind of go around the whole church or wherever it is, and I set that 55 up on my monopod, which is what I've been filming on the whole time. And I'm going to keep that 55 aimed right down the aisle for the majority of the ceremony. As I feel like things are wrapping up, what I do is, knowing that I've got 2 cameras filming the majority of the ceremony, I can take a second to switch my 55 off my camera 1 and I put on my 24mm lens and I put that whole setup on a gimbal. And as I feel like the ceremony is reaching an end and I want to get the kiss at the very end and also want to be able to walk out with the bride and groom, I'm gonna get nice and close on my gimbal. I'm still gonna be in 1080p, 60 frames per second. I'm gonna get the kiss that can now be in slow motion, and I'm gonna kind of walk backwards with the bride and groom as they're leaving the ceremony. So the switch from the 55 to the 24 is a little bit frantic because you're trying to tell, all right, when are they gonna do the kiss? And a lot of times it's just good to talk with the minister ahead of time, the officiant, whoever it is that's doing the wedding, and saying, where is the kiss? We've done weddings where the kiss is in the middle of the ceremony, which, whatever, but to each their own. So trying to make those adjustments and making sure that you're able to nail the most important parts of the ceremony is just ideal. So again, to recap, I've got one camera on one side with the 70-200, another on the other side with the 85, and then one down the middle with the 55 for the majority of the wedding. That's probably the footage I'm gonna use the most, but having those 2 on the other side is great for when you're cutting between different angles, especially if you're not covering 100% of the ceremony with your camera 1, which is me to a T. I'm aimed down the aisle, getting the bridesmaids and the bride as she's coming down, getting a cut shot of the groom, his reaction shot to the bride. Then I'm circling around, and during that time, I'm not filming. until I get to the head of the aisle and I'm shooting back down towards the bride and the groom. And then I'm making the change from the 55 to the 24 for the end of the ceremony. I need some shots to cut to, especially if I'm also delivering a documentary edit, which would be the entire ceremony. I want to make sure that I've got other angles to cover so that it doesn't look like I've missed certain aspects of their wedding. Hopefully that was not confusing and very helpful to you as you just consider how you want to set up for a ceremony. Now, as sort of a bonus here, there are also times where I have a 2-camera setup right in the middle of the aisle. Obviously nothing that's distracting or confusing. And what I'll do is I'll have the 85 set up right next to a 55, something that's just a little bit further back. And then my third camera will be on a gimbal, just kind of trying to get a little bit of detail shots and a little motion shots before they come down the aisle. And then right as they come down the aisle, I kind of take those cameras, move them off to the side so that the bride and groom can actually walk down, and then I can still get the gimbal shots going down. So do I switch it up from time to time? Absolutely. Kids' toys. Well, I hope this was really helpful to you. Hopefully it gives you a little bit of a mindset in how I set up for my weddings. If you really like the look of my weddings, if you like the angles that I'm getting, this is probably a setup that you should try out. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment. I will get back to you as soon as possible. We really love this stuff. We have a passion for it, and honestly, we switch things up all the time. Right now, this is how we've done the majority of our weddings for 2018, and I don't see us changing that really that much in 2019. So again, like this video, subscribe if you're into that. We have so many different things we want to teach you about wedding filmmaking, and hope that you can just take your game to the next level and honestly make a full go of this whole idea of wedding filmmaking. Thanks again so much for joining us, and as always, happy filmmaking.